Actually, go online. It was really cool. I emailed him once saying that how can I get back to you, so I figured he'd figure it out. All right. Yeah. I'm just really smart.
Where you guys at?
I'm gonna go back.
Yeah, I know.
You went to the bathroom.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I was really interested in how you quantify it.
So anyway, so I'm going to my Google account.
They have a lot of content to share with you, so they've given you a handout to kind of give you the peripheral knowledge, the information. And then they're going to go through a model and do what they do. So, thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Everyone get a handout by any chance? Everyone's got one. You guys two, right? You're all good? Perfect. Oh, yeah.
Full start. And then magic.
Wow, fancy. All right, so my name is Joe Molino, and I'm a senior biology major.
I'm Rowan Flynn. I'm a junior in finance and DI double major.
And today we're presenting using breast cancer data, we are making a prediction and recommending a diagnosis and how that applies to healthcare.
So we begin looking at why data is so important in the first place, particularly in the healthcare industry. The healthcare industry specifically, you have a multi-dimensional opportunity cost here because you have both the medical practitioner and the patient as well. So you want to maximize that quality care, but you also want to minimize any unnecessary spending. So you're really trying to find the optimal point between those two. And there's also scarcity of not only resources, but time as well. As Tychek always mentions, there is that opportunity cost. Especially in the healthcare industry with medical practitioners, they only have so much time they can spend. There's always that heavy demand for medical practitioners. So with the limited supply we constantly have to make sure their time is well spent. And with the healthcare industry, stakes are higher. There's human life at stake, especially with breast cancer, which we're examining today. This is a deadly disease, of course. And we need to make sure that care is optimal because the stakes are so high. And descriptive data analysis is highly reliable in many instances within this industry because, yes, there's technological advancements just as any other industry, but the human body is going to remain pretty much the same except for some gradual evolutionary changes. So descriptive analytics, where you look at past data like patient data, for today we have data from about 1990 or so. What do you say, Joe?
Late 90s.
So this is older data, but because the healthcare industry and its biology and human anatomy, we're able to use that data still to predict. And we can see here we have the data triangle. So we take this raw data, and when it's just raw data as a form, there's really not much you can do with it from the surface unless you know all about it and can put it all together. But as data analysts, we take a look at that data and turn it into information. What can we draw conclusions from this? We form hypotheses. We're like scientists with this data here. Form hypotheses and dive into the data, test things out, and see what we can draw from that. This information over time turns into knowledge as it takes further steps as we put this into application into the industry. This knowledge gradually transforms into wisdom then as you progress years down the road and this accumulates in the healthcare industry. Not only the healthcare industry, but as a whole.
Right, so the current model of healthcare right now, it's very inefficient, as some of you guys may know. There's a lot of unnecessary spending, and on your sheet there is roughly $16.5 billion just in the United States alone spent on healthcare. But yet we are not the most efficient. We do not have the best health rates, so the outcomes don't reflect how much money we put into it. I think it's, from research and my personal opinion, we drew the conclusion that the fee-for-base service, essentially physicians charging you just to run treatments or just to run tests just because they want your money, is morally wrong, because healthcare is focused on you, like how well you're doing. So there's a huge trend in the healthcare industry to go towards this value-based model where they value the person. Transferring to this model, it helps lower healthcare costs and improves the quality and the outcome of the patient. So you see in the model here, there's technology and data. So Rowan talked about using data, and it's the biggest portion for a reason, because you can draw a lot of insights with hospital practices and how they manage their practice and their operation, but also at the population health. So looking at the demographics of the patient, knowing and understanding the patient. But there's also a multitude of information about the individual person, like looking at your genetics, looking at your own cells. I don't want to dive too much into science, but there's a lot of information in your body that physicians can use to better diagnose your disease. In this case, it's breast cancer. One, to save money for you, and really value the outcome of your diagnosis. So moving on to our actual data. Our data was extracted from Kaggle. It's also found in the Wisconsin Breast Cancer Database, and this is the data was from back in the late 1990s. So a lot of people have used this data set to practice building models, which we use as a source. But before we dive into the data, you guys got a handout, and on the back page kind of talks about fine needle aspiration biopsy. So our data is reflective of this procedure. So essentially, when you have a mass, when the physician thinks you have a mass in your breast, they have preliminary screenings, such as mammograms, ultrasounds, and whatnot. And once they deem that there's some abnormalities in it, they want to run a test. Typically, it's called a biopsy. They want to analyze that breast mass or that tumor in your breast. And one specific type that this data reflects is a fine needle aspiration biopsy. And the nucleus, which is essentially the center of the cell. So essentially think of the nucleus as the sun, and the solar system is the cell. So by looking at the nucleus, because our variables, the data we have, represents characteristics of the nucleus. So the radius, texture, perimeter, all reflects on the nucleus. And what we looked at was, can we predict the diagnosis? Is it malignant or benign? So malignant is cancerous tumor. Benign is non-cancerous tumor. That one isn't as dangerous. There's not a lot of spending compared to malignant tumor, because malignant tumors are very complicated. There's a ton of different subtypes of cancers within malignant tumors, but benign tumors are a little bit more simpler. And so what we looked at was all these 10 variables that we were given, and we narrowed it down to 6 important variables to help predict whether the tumor was benign or malignant.
So now we jump ahead to the dashboard we put together and really the data that we access. So you can see here, after we put these 6 variables together, we put together a few histograms just to show how these variables stack up. As you can see here, the blue is for benign, while the orange here is for malignant. Yes, there is some overlap with these variables, but they are, especially with things such as concavity and perimeter, they are quite distinct. So we gained some confidence from that and really felt like we could put together an accurate prediction model. And just to point out too, we have a pie chart here that canvasses the data and just shows what we were working with. So about a third of it, only about a third was malignant, so actually cancerous, and a little under 2/3 was benign. Now when it comes to a lot of industries, when you're doing this healthcare analysis, you may run into some troubles when you have that unbalanced data. with the healthcare industry, because we're going for that one primary goal, determine if it's benign or malignant, depending on the accuracy of your model, that unbalanced set of data may not be that much of a factor. In this case, it worked to our advantage. And as we'll get into in the next part of this, we began to put together this prediction model and see really what's all up with that.
So what we did first was kind of do a broad analysis of what Rowan expected, the data that we were given. I did more descriptive analysis. Now we wanted to predict based off of the 6 variables, which is perimeter, mean, compactness, concavity, and concave points. And so essentially concavity means if the cell is indented inwards and how far it's really indented. And to really grasp this, and I think I missed this in the overview earlier, so when we analyzed this tissue sample, they put it on a slide, and physicians and scientists view that slide through either a software or a microscope. And this data was obtained by using a software where you could view slides through a computer, and they traced what they thought was the nucleus. And this was the output. The output was the data that was given in our data set. So all these different variables and characteristics were given from the software. And typically, because you can't measure, the radius and perimeter of a cell because it is tiny, you can't physically do that. So the software gave them that ability to do so. So going back to our model, we narrowed it down to 6 variables, which I explained, which is radius, perimeter, area, compactness, concavity, and concave points. And essentially, our model could predict the probability that your tumor is cancerous based off of the 6 variables that I mentioned. So as you can see here, we were able to test our data and see if it was correct. So we were able to train our data and then see it was correct based off of our test data. And going over to this classification table, our output was that we predicted with 92% accuracy which tumors were malignant or not. So essentially, the 191 up here suggests that we predicted 191 malignant tumors correctly, whereas we only predicted 21 wrong. And the same thing with benign. We predicted 321 benign tumors correctly and 23 wrong. So that's where we get our 92% prediction accuracy for this data for our model. And looking at our ROC curve, that just shows how strong our prediction was. It wasn't very, as you see here, the axes here, the true positive rate, it's very strong, whereas if it was very inaccurate, it'd be more towards the x-axis here. And then our R squared was 0.729, so it ranges between -1 to 1. And so the higher it is to 1, the stronger it is. Whereas 0, if it was closer to 0, that'd be weaker. So it shows that our prediction model is very accurate.
So moving on, we have to acknowledge that there is some limitations, not just with the data we acted with, but in the healthcare industry as a whole. For us, there was a limited amount of data present. We had to take this older data. In our case, it didn't really affect us too much because, like we mentioned, biology and anatomy doesn't shift all that much with the human body. So we were able to take that older data. But there really is very sparse data out there for us to take. And the healthcare industry as a whole is reluctantly accepting the emergence of data analytics. These past 5 years or so, we've been starting to get into this. And you can see on your worksheet and the handout here, this is an infographic from 7 years ago now. So it's a little bit outdated, but I think it still rings pretty accurately here in 2017, where it says 80% of healthcare data is unstructured. So there's all this data out there that we would be able to pull in, but it needs to be available to us. Not only that, but it's subject to a higher risk of subjectivity within the healthcare industry. These medical practitioners really value the work they put in to get there. In other words, they sometimes don't want to be wrong, and they don't like it when data tells them that they're wrong, because this is the methods they have been working with, and this is how they got to that position. And as you can see with the image here, with this data kind of closed off and being hard to get, as Ratajczyk always mentions, we're Einstein at the chalkboard. So I got this idea of this little kid who's knocking at the door as data analysts. And as long as we get in, we're willing to play around with the data and really take some steps forward. It's just a matter of letting us in and examining that data.
So what does that all mean in terms of why does that matter to healthcare, to us, to physicians, to everyone else? So essentially, we took the raw data and we were able to draw some insights from it. And to apply it to a healthcare setting, I said that physicians and scientists use a software to kind of trace a cell and see if it's malignant or not. Essentially, what we created was, or our idea was that we created a model that can give them the probability that they could use in the diagnosis. So essentially, it's a supplemental tool for physicians to use to aid their diagnosis, because all their tests is subjective to that patient. But what about looking at trends? And Rowan talked about limited data. What if you had access to more data? We could draw further insights to get a better diagnosis specific to the patient themselves. Looking at assessing risk, using the probability that we can get from our model, we can determine risk as a step to see what direction of treatment or what path of treatment they want to go to. So if they have a high risk for getting malignant tumor, then obviously they need to progress further into more in-depth tests. I don't want to dive into it. There's a lot of different blood tests and sample tests to see and to specify the actual type of malignant tumor that is, but none of that's really important in this presentation. But also there's medium and lower risk. So if it's not that, if it's a very, if the doctor's very undecisive on their diagnosis, they can see the prediction, the base prediction that our model gives them and see what risk they want to go into. So if it's medium, if we classify it as a medium risk, it's kind of discretion to the patient, like, hey, like you're giving the patient the knowledge instead of the doctor having the power. Because right now it's all right, you got to do this test, and you got to do this test because we think you have, a malignant tumor, or you think you have this. But the patient is kind of blind to that. This gives them that, hey, this gives them a percent that this is the probability that I have this based off of past data. That all makes sense. So it really gives information to the patient, and it also aids physicians with their diagnosis. So we can eliminate misdiagnosis, because that's one of the biggest costs in healthcare is wrongful diagnosing the wrong disease. So that's a lot of the unnecessary spending in healthcare. So essentially, to sum all that up, we want to take the data that was given to us and use an algorithm based off of our model, implement that algorithm into a computer system to view the cells. So when they do trace that nucleus, it can give us a probability of malignancy right on the spot. So those 6 variables, we want to expand that. Instead of just 6 variables, we want to expand that with more access to data, which is a little bit complex in the healthcare system with HIPAA and all. But using data from the patient, using data from the population, using data from genetics, we can predict with high accuracy a right diagnosis, and it's on the spot. So it's all real time that reflects all the past data. And taking the next step, and I talked a lot about it already, because we want to really transform healthcare and make it about you, right? So we take all the data about you, we can draw insights specific to you and better predict your diagnosing. And it's not limited to just diagnostic procedures, it's limited to your heart rate, your blood pressure. We wear these devices, the Fitbits that measure your heart rate and blood tests. So what if we were able to send that data to the physicians themselves so they can manage your what's it called? I'm blanking on it. They can manage your like heart rate, blood pressure, and kind of those types of tests, and see if there's a trend, and they can better see if maybe that spike in blood pressure that you had in that office because of that fried chicken you ate this morning or something like that. So they can use that data and see from a broader perspective, the correct the correct I can't talk today. The correct diagnosis.
Yeah, and really taking this next step, yes, there's going to be obstacles. We have to be realistic about this. As you can see on your handout as well, the infographic on the front part of it does an excellent job of this in a simplistic way. The obstacles, primary obstacles here are privacy concerns. Think about with the emergence of big data, a lot of the main concern is, where is my privacy? I want that privacy. And this is a hot topic in the news today. And I think a lot of people need to realize that yes, there may be some privacy concerns, and there's that potential for hacking and security threats, but the benefits outweigh the costs in this sense, at least from our perspective. And there's going to be that resistance from patients and doctors in the healthcare industry specifically. Like I said, doctors, they know the work they've went in to get there and all the research they've committed. They don't want to be told by data they're wrong, but they have to remember that it's all about the patient. As we mentioned, there's human life at stake here. The stakes are very high. And as the promise is too, savings up to $1 billion a year. And as we progress further, we can make that even bigger and bigger as we become more efficient. And I love the quote here, that's a shift toward evidence-based treatment. Yes, we always love the intelligence of the medical practitioners, and we definitely honor that. With the use of data, we can make it even more accurate and everything. And looking at the data triangle again, as we mentioned, our goal is to transform this raw data into information and then knowledge, which compiles into wisdom. Yes, this isn't going to happen in the blink of an eye. It's a process. But every step we take, as with our project, it's a part of that bigger leap towards the top of that pyramid. And it's really going to bring the healthcare industry to the greatest heights it's ever seen, not only in terms of efficiency, but quality of care as well as the level of accuracy presented with our data. So it's increasing really the prominence of this objective dimension in this previously heavily subjective intellectual landscape. It'll take it to places it's never been before.
Now, is there any questions? I know we dove into some deep medical stuff, and I know some of you are not at the same level of relative science background. So if you have any questions with our model, our data, or anything in our presentation, floor is open.
First of all, thank you. I found it really interesting, and you put together data analytics and some stuff about the healthcare industry and medicine and all. I'm just thinking out loud about the different stakeholders in something like this, and you talked about the healthcare industry.
Mm-hmm.
I think of research scientists. I think of people who crunch the numbers for data analytics. I think of the practicing physician, and then I think of the patient. My suspicion would be that the first 3 or 4 of those groups would trust and rely more on the data than maybe with the patient. If I'm a 25-year-old woman and I got 3 kids, I'm not sure I would trust your 92% predictability that I do or do not have a cancerous tumor. I would think most physicians probably would say, you know, the chances are this, and maybe even more so the persons in the lab, the research people, would trust those numbers more objectively. You have the slide in there about the objective and the subjective attention. And certainly I think healthcare industry would want to go very much with those chances. So I don't really have a question. I guess it's an observation, or it invites a response. But part of it too, it seems to me, is of all of those groups, it involves a lot of education.
Definitely. That's definitely is true, because Rowan talked about obstacles as resistance to data. And that's because we haven't really seen what data can do. We haven't reaped the full benefits of data in healthcare. We see data's benefits in more retail, kind of the commercialized industry, but with healthcare, there's always this lag. And we can see that right now because there's all these regulations, FDA, different protocols that have to be implemented dealing with healthcare because it's all about the patient, it's dealing with someone's life. So there's a lag period implementing data. We haven't reaped the benefits, the full benefits of what data can do. So essentially, there's a lot of education that needs to be done. So once that's definitely on the doctors and the scientists to explain to the patient, this is what I think about your diagnosis. And what we introduced is a tool for them. So the doctor can still use their test, and then you use this, be like, hey, it's an aid. We're not trying to replace the doctor.
Right.
It's more of like, hey, if there's a doctor out there that maybe got a shady degree or something, it won't really work. You know, eliminates them.
Not a St. Mary's grant.
Not in St. Mary's, exactly. But if there's a doctor that, you know, it's a really complex case, they can use the data and be like, hey, so this person belongs in this genetic pool and it's from this race. They can predict with stronger accuracy based off the previous trends of that specific ailment, if that makes sense. So pretty much with breast cancer, say like you're analyzing breast cancer data, you want to look at different races. Does that have to do with it? You can look at genetic factors. Does that have to do with it? And you pull that all together to give a stronger prediction. But then there is that resistance to this model of care because it is different from what the doctors have, you know, practiced. They spent 8+ years learning how to practice medicine in a certain way, and this is just completely changing it. So before this needs to be implemented, medical schools need to use data as part of their curriculum, which right now isn't really getting implemented. So this is more of a long-term implementation, because right now there is that resistance towards data in healthcare. But you know, we can see in our current society, in certain healthcare practices, thinking about like, I don't know if you guys are from Minnesota, but with the Alina Abbott strike, reason for that was because of the investment in healthcare catalyst, and the nurses were getting the brunt of the cut, so they were getting cut of their healthcare insurance because the healthcare system wanted to invest into this company called Health Catalyst. Health Catalyst essentially does what I say: look at patient data, look at data from all sorts of perspectives, and then implements that into healthcare. So you can see from big organizations, big health systems, that there is this shift to using healthcare data, but it's so new at this point that we can't, as the average Joe, we don't know what that means, pun intended. But does that kind of clear it up?
Yeah.
I just want to say piggybacking. Sorry, don't mean to interject, but piggybacking off that too, like you mentioned, it's a lot of it's centered on the patients. And I think one of those reasons is we've seen big data come up in like the last 5 to 10 years. And when we hear about it, it's more behind the scenes, right? Like companies, you know, oh, they're utilizing big data. That's great of them, but like we don't understand what exactly they're doing with their data and everything. And when it comes to the healthcare, we really had to put it right in front of them and just say, hey, you know, based off this, and this, we have determined that you have a 70% chance of breast cancer. So it's more at the forefront. So I think part of the reason that big data has been kind of lagging behind in healthcare industry as relative to other industries, it's not only is there a lot of regulations and hoops to jump through, but the patients see that big data up front. And when they're actually confronted with big data, it's kind of a more cultural shift. They have to accept that as well as the patients.
And you did mention stakeholders as well, and that has to do with, there might be resistance into using data because it saves money for the patient, and then so the stakeholders are like, well, they're taking, you know, my money. So that has to do with a shift in that philosophy for healthcare, I guess, because there's a huge shift to value the patient instead of the fee for service, and that's starting to get implemented in a lot of different practices. But it's subjective to the company, subjective to their mission. But if we do change the value model, we do, as patients and as people, reap the benefits instead of the corporations with that. So, third question.
Yeah, I'm curious, initially you presented 10 variables that were in the data set, and then in the analysis in the model there were just 6 variables. And I was curious if you could just talk briefly about that process. You know, did you factor some of the like variables together or just slice them out completely? And along the same lines, if your data set had additional variables, what would you add? If I know you were constrained by the data set you were given,
yes,
but are there any additional variables that might have increased that predicting power from 92% to something higher?
Definitely. And so we narrowed down the 10 to 6 using a correlation plot, so seeing how the data correlates with one another. And you can see here with the green kind of background text box, those are the ones that have higher correlation. So those variables relate to one another, whereas the ones in the red have no relevance to the different variables. And so we used this, and we also used, as Rowan mentioned, the histograms. To look at the trends of the data. The other 4 variables had kind of overlapping data, meaning there's no distinction between benign or malignant. Here you can kind of see there's sort of a trend where the orange is malignant and the benign is blue. You can kind of see distinctions within the diagnosis that, hey, malignants tend to have a higher area compared to benign, whereas the other 4 variables were all kind of overlapped, and it's harder to distinct those two characteristics of the cell. And then including with if we had more access to data, it would be, without getting too into it, I think it would be relative to the type of cancer that they have. So it would be like blood tests, like using blood tests, using genetic tests, using imaging tests. So there's MRIs, so using data analysis off of the imaging screen through essentially imaging, artificial intelligence techniques to draw insights from that, and using all that together to kind of come up with one prediction, which is all a lot of if, ands, and buts. But if we're able to harness all that information and pull it all together, it could, give us a stronger prediction, like you mentioned.
Great, thank you.
There's a lot of this data. Did you find problems with obtaining the data through, like, doctor-patient confidentiality? Was that ever an issue, do you think, for disclosing this kind of information?
So this data set was just open. It's open to anyone right now on Kaggle on the website. So we didn't have to. This isn't data that we extracted. We were just given this data set. But that is an issue with data in healthcare, that we as a patient have to agree to release our information on data. So like sometimes when you're in an appointment, sometimes the doctors will have you sign a release of information to be included for the study, even though they can't pinpoint like you as a person. Some people have problems with that. So that would have to be, that is a barrier that we talked about, having patients agree to this. And what happens, it kind of puts a little bit more subjectivity to it, because what about the people who said no to providing information? So does that kind of clear it up?
Yeah.
What was the most challenging part of this project?
For me, it was balancing all the different perspectives and kind of making I guess in the presentation, making a general statement of what it all can do. As experience with data, it was hard to kind of go into it and then kind of pairing that with what it could do to healthcare, and then pairing that all with the medical information and trying to see what it can do in a basic statement, I guess. So that was my hardest thing to do with this project.
The biggest struggle for me was like making sense of the math when it came to the prediction model. Not just that, but with a cell, you have to do it on one computer pretty much. You can't, it's not like a Google Doc where you can work on it at the same time. So that brought up some inefficiencies just when it came to tackling the work, because it's like, who's going to be on the computer, who's going to be researching on another computer. But I think we managed to work around that complication quite well.
How many slides did you present?
It's about 10 slides.
How many did you show me the other day?
About 28, and that wasn't even all of them. That's what I gave you the handout.
So they had a lot of good information. They're well researched. They dug into it a bit. But we knew that we couldn't present that many. so a lot of work went into it.
Any more questions? Otherwise, thank you guys.